and welcome. You're watching NewsX World. I'm Megha Sharma and this is the World Report. Let's take a look at the top headlines of the hour. Wall Street opened mixed on Wednesday as investors reacted to the latest U.S. tariff hike and the retaliatory measures coming in from China and European Union. The Dow Jones was down 0.6%, Nasdaq gained 0.5%. China hits back at America with 84% retaliatory tariffs. This comes after U.S. tariffs of 104% on China kicked off today. China says it will continue to take resolute and forceful countermeasures. China says that U.S. has used blackmail over the Panama Canal, as American Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says that U.S. will take back this canal from Chinese influence. Beijing has called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's claims as baseless after the European leader said that more Chinese troops were fighting for Russia. It comes as two reported Chinese nationals were captured fighting against Kyiv's forces. The death toll from a nightclub roof collapse in Dominican Republic has now risen to 113 as per the emergency services. Rescue efforts continue in Santo Domingo following the disaster during a concert. Germany's incoming coalition government pledges to significantly boost defense spending in response to concerns over American commitment to European security under President Trump. The agreement was outlined by CDU, CSU and the Social Democrats. Yemen's Houthi media said on Wednesday the number of people killed in an airstrike on Hodeo the day before that they blamed on the Americans has risen to 10 people. Houthi media said the strike had targeted a residential area in the Red Sea port city. Iran says it is ready to engage with America on talks over a nuclear deal only if America stops military threats. Iran's foreign minister says talks with a view to seal a deal could take place on Saturday. In a major move, the European Union has approved its first set of retaliatory tariffs to counter American steel and aluminium duties. The tariffs set to be implemented from 15th of April target a range of American goods, marking the European Union's response to President Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on metal imports. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has emphasized the EU's preference for a negotiated resolution but warned of further countermeasures if talks fail. The tariffs will affect the $420 billion worth of European exports to America, with the EU preparing for additional measures in coming weeks. Wall Street stocks are mixed as markets react to the latest trade tensions. America raised tariffs prompted China and European Union to retaliate. Dow is slipping, the S&P is edging slightly lower, while Nasdaq is gaining, driven by tech stocks. Investors are watching closely to see how these trade moves play out. In a significant development, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has stated that countries choosing not to retaliate against President Donald Trump's latest tariffs will not face higher rates. Meanwhile, U.S. dollar is under pressure. It has fallen sharply against the safe haven currencies like the yen and the Swiss franc. Analysts warn of increasing recession risks. Signs of de-dollarization are also emerging as investors pull out of U.S. assets to cover losses. Oil prices have suffered a steep drop down, nearly 20% since April 2nd. That's when President Trump announced higher tariffs on trading partners. This marks the biggest 5-day decline since March 2022. Morgan Stanley analysts have now lowered their forecasts. They expect oil prices to remain weak through the rest of 2025. Ayanaba on the telecast with me. Ayanaba, take us through all the markets, S&P, Dow Jones, how are they reacting?
Yes, Megha. Let us move first to NewsX, which is a global economic marketplace which is crucial for tech and growth stocks. We can see that NASDAQ currently stands at 17,349.50 points. It has gained 105.75 points. It has gained 0.61%. Now, moving to Dow Jones. Dow Jones is a stock market index which tracks 30 large publicly owned blue chip companies like Apple and Microsoft. We can see that it currently stands at 37,781.07 points. It has gained 135.48 points. It has gained 0.06%. Moving on to S&P 500, which includes 500 leading US publicly traded companies. S&P 500 currently stands at 5,017.83 points. It has gained 35.06 points, which is basically 0.70%. Over to you, Megha, in the studio.
All right, so there you look. Our markets are in the green today. They have recovered in the last 3 days. Joining me on the telecast is John Rosamundo. John, what do you make of NASDAQ, Dow Jones, S&P all up marginally?
Look at the trends in the stock market. They go up, they go down. I think that right now the U.S. The reaction to Trump's tariffs have been absorbed by the market, and now I think that it'll return up. I mean, if you look historically over the past few years, going back to the pandemic and before, you have sharp drops in the market, and they always bounce back.
Right, absolutely. What do you make of European Union now imposing fresh set of tariffs against the metal tariffs that have been imposed by Donald Trump administration?
Well, I think that the Europeans are trying to show President Trump that his actions will not go unanswered. I think that President Trump is trying to be transformational here. He views his tariffs as a way to reset the global economy, which he believes, going back decades, has been to the detriment of America. I think the number one thing that he's trying to overcome is the massive trade imbalance between the U.S. and Europe. You have a lot of people on his own side who are saying that these tariffs could lead to a recession, depression. So I think that it depends on how long the pain continues. And, the president right now is staying the course.
Absolutely. What the Europeans and the Chinese are upset about is the tone and tenor that has been used by President Trump when imposing those heavy tariffs. They are hoping that, the conversations become more reconciliatory instead of the aggressiveness that has been shown. Do you think that is going to be on the anvil?
Well, I think that President Trump is not like any of his predecessors. He thrives in adversity and in confrontation. So President Trump is trying to be the big dog on the block to get concessions from the Europeans and from the Chinese. President Trump, looks at China and says, "Hey, we have a bigger economy. We have more, to gain. You have more to lose. The biggest weakness of the Chinese economy is its command structure, which might be a lot more resilient compared to, say, the old Soviet model, but it's still a very significant weakness. The Chinese say they have a 5% growth rate, but you have analysts say that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and Xi Jinping has a lot more to lose."
Okay, all right. In fact, exactly the opposite sentiment coming in from the Chinese side. Keeping in mind, they say that the total exports of China to America just amount to about 2% of the country's GDP, and therefore it is not going to be as impactful as Trump thinks it would be to the Chinese economy. Thank you, John, for joining me on the telecast. Meanwhile, let's shift our focus to the other big development. Iran is preparing to engage in crucial talks with the United States this Saturday over its nuclear program, according to the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Now, Iran is ready for indirect negotiations, aiming to secure a deal, but has set a key condition. President Trump must rule out the use of military force. Donald Trump, who withdrew the U.S. from 2015 nuclear deal during his first term, has warned that Iran will be in great danger if talks fail. Iran has allegedly violated the terms of the deal in response to U.S. sanctions and has stockpiled enough highly enriched uranium. Despite this, Tehran insists its nuclear activities are peaceful. With tensions high, these upcoming discussions in Oman could determine the future of U.S.-Iran relations and global security. Daniel Roth on the telecast with me. Daniel, what's going on between U.S. and Iran, and do you think there is likelihood of the Trump administration reimposing heavy sanctions on Iran with regards to the nuclear deal?
Good evening. Yes, I mean, as your previous guest alluded to, talking about President Trump, this is a similar kind of tactic that he's using. I think he is, there is an evolving Trump doctrine when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it's pretty simple. He's giving the regime in Tehran a choice, a very stark choice. It's either dismantle your Iranian nuclear program entirely, or ultimately see the regime fall. It's really quite stark. I think it's getting to that kind of point. He has really threatened quite strongly that Iran is no longer going to have a nuclear weapon or have a nuclear program at all. And the other choice he's alluding to quite strongly is that, or there will be military strikes against that nuclear infrastructure. In terms of the actual deal itself, the prospects, I am very skeptical that a deal can be made, given that President Trump said that the previous deal that Iran agreed to, the JCPOA, that was nowhere near strong enough, and indeed he withdrew from. And the Iranians now are more entrenched than they were even 10 years ago. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on Saturday. But the president is giving it a chance at least.
Daniel, what role is Russia going to play in terms of, I don't know, is there going to be a mediation that happens from the Russian side? Russians have time and again shown their allegiance and support to the Iranians. How is Trump going to negotiate with both nations, keeping in mind they have been approached, in fact, Donald Trump approached Russia to get on the saddle and work with it when it approaches Iran over its nuclear deal issue?
Yeah, the Russian element is interesting. You may have seen from the US side, they're talking about, quote, direct negotiations, whereas Foreign Minister Araghchi of Iran has said very clearly that it's indirect negotiations. I don't think it makes too much difference whether they're direct or indirect. Ultimately, they will be speaking to each other. The Russian angle, I mean, I think it's the Omanis actually that would be doing the mediating in this instance. I think Trump certainly has a less fractious relationship with Russia, with President Putin, than his predecessor, so there may be some role for the Russians there. But ultimately, I think, despite the fact that Russia and Iran are currently quite simpatico on certain issues. For example, Iran is supplying Russia with all those drones for the Russian invasion and occupation of Ukraine. I think Russia really is on the side of the rest of the world when it comes to this big key, which is that it doesn't want the Islamic Republic to have nuclear weapons. Despite everything else, the bottom line is Iran cannot have those nukes, and I think even President Putin would ascribe to that.
Why is Russia's role so important and significant in the Trump administration being able to persuade Iran to let go of its nuclear program?
Well, Russia played a big role in the JCPOA, the previous agreement under President Obama. Russia was a destination for some of this uranium that Iran transferred out of the country, so that it has that role to play. Russia has supplied some of the civilian nuclear infrastructure for Iran, which was agreed upon under the agreement. But yes, there is this Ukraine-Russia dynamic at play. The fact that President Trump is very insistent that this Russia-Ukraine war comes to an end, that is all factoring into it. But as I say, I think on the big issue, I think President Putin and President Trump are very much aligned. Iran, Russia really is within Iran's crosshairs even more than the United States. I would say the same for India as well in terms of how far those nuclear weapons could reach. The ballistic missiles can reach 1,600 kilometers, I think, at the outset. That's well within Russian territory, Indian territory as well, if we're talking about the region. So Russia, U.S., I think they will be aligned on this, but on Saturday, I'm not sure that the Russians are going to have a big role to play.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Daniel, for joining me and sharing your views. Russian and U.S. officials will be meeting in Istanbul on Thursday to discuss normalizing embassy operations, the State Department has said. The talks will focus solely on the functioning of the respective embassies and will not include political or security issues such as the war in Ukraine. The Russian delegation will be led by Ambassador Alexander Dovchev, and the U.S. team will be headed by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Sonata Kulta. Listen in to what Tammy Bruce, the U.S. State Department spokesperson, said.
On April 10th, U.S. and Russian delegations will meet for a second time in Istanbul to try to make progress on further stabilizing the operations of our bilateral missions. So that is happening in Istanbul. There are no political or security issues on the agenda, and Ukraine is not, absolutely not on the agenda. These talks are solely focused on our embassy operations, not on normalizing a bilateral relationship overall, which can only happen, as we've noted, once there is peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Meanwhile, China has urged its citizens to stay away from war zones after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that there were 2 Chinese nationals who were captured fighting for Russia. Beijing has rejected all such claims that a significant number of Chinese soldiers were fighting in Ukraine, calling the allegations groundless. Listen into what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said.
这种说法毫无根据。中方在乌克兰危机问题上的立场是清晰的、明确的，得到国际社会的广泛认可。乌方应正确看待中方为政治解决乌克兰危机问题所做的努力和发挥的建设性作用。
In yet another development, Ukraine has reported at least 21 injured after Russia launched 55 drones in an overnight attack. This comes as Russia claims it is pushing the last of Ukraine's forces out of Kursk region towards the border. Additionally, the acting U.S. ambassador to the United Nations said that U.S. will not tolerate bad faith negotiations on Ukraine, demanding that Russia honor commitments to a ceasefire. Joining me on the telecast right now is Micah Pickers. Micah, thanks for joining us. And my first question to you about the charges that have been leveled against China by the Ukrainian president, that there were Chinese nationals that were operating on the soil of Ukraine, fighting the war of the Russians against Ukraine. What do you make of that?
It's certainly an interesting development. It wouldn't shock me on the one hand. We're still waiting for the dust to settle, but I would point to the fact that there was a very, very heavy North Korean participation in the war on the Russian side. So the fact that that sort of axis of countries which do have deep ties with one another may be participating is not entirely shocking, but I also, it makes sense that Beijing would deny it outright.
Okay, and talking about the strikes and counter-strikes and the claims and counter-claims being made by the Ukrainians and the Russians about each striking the other territory. How do we know what is propaganda, what is a narrative that is being built by each of the nations? And do you think the talks that happened in Saudi Arabia came to any fruition, keeping in mind the war continues?
Yeah, so two questions that are really, really good questions. The first question I'd respond to, I would say, I think it's important to look for the sorts of institutions that are particularly good at cutting through the noise and getting to the basis of things. So I would point to the Institute for the Study of War here in Washington, D.C. They've been doing some incredible work on tracking the Ukraine conflict since its inception, and they're using a lot of open source material. And they just have a very, very robust, incredible process for the way that they develop their analyses. So that would be one source I would point people towards if they really want to find, a really solid overview of what's happening on a daily basis. As far as the talks in Riyadh that you mentioned, it's really hard to tell, right? On the balance of things, it doesn't look like much has been accomplished. We know Trump is very insistent on wanting this war to come to a close. And on the one hand, it seems like Putin has signaled he also is interested on it, but his words and his actions aren't exactly lining up, right? As you mentioned, the war still continues, and yet there continues to be this tit for tat exchange with strikes and a lot of pointing fingers. So I think the bottom line is that this war is going to be much harder to end than Trump thought it would be.
Right. And what do you make of the delegation level talks that are going to take place in Istanbul later on? That's happening tomorrow between the Russians and the Americans. Do you think that the issue with regards to the ceasefire deal that at this point of time is hanging in balance will be discussed? And do you think anything fruitful will come out of it?
So actually, I'm cautiously optimistic about this. The folks that both Darshev and Coulter and Bruce, who have spoken to press, have been pretty clear that they're not going to be trying to discuss broader political or security topics like Ukraine. And so in some sense, I'm actually slightly, like I said, cautiously optimistic that maybe there will be some normalization going on here. And the reason I say that is because Trump has signaled from the outset that he would like some sort of normalization and rapprochement with Russia. And the sticking point has been the Russia-Ukraine war, but sort of trying to drill down a few levels deeper and to find things that maybe don't necessarily need to involve Ukraine at the moment. That seems to be the Trump administration's angle. And I think if Ukraine is not being discussed, I think there probably is some hope for productive discussions. Who's to say what that will actually entail is anybody's best guess. What I will say, however, is if they've said broader political and security topics like Ukraine aren't going to come up, and then they do come up, then we're looking at a totally different kettle of fish. I think if that happens, I wouldn't be shocked if Russia said, well, you, the United States, said you weren't going to bring these things up, and then you brought things up, and then things fall apart. So there's definitely a very sort of high risk, high reward thing where it could fall apart at any minute if a sensitive topic like Ukraine were to be brought up when it was not supposed to be on the table to begin with, if that makes sense.
Do you think President Trump would have thought it to be such an uphill battle? Because as soon as he came to power, he said and very decisively that I'm going to end the war. It seemed as if he thought it to be a cakewalk, but it clearly isn't.
I think Trump misjudged just how deeply entrenched this conflict is. And we have to remember that this conflict is much deeper than something that began in 2022 or 2014. There's a lot of history there, and that history has then been compounded by current events, such as the fact that this war has now been stretching on for 3 years. And that's not something you get out of overnight. You could have the best diplomats in the world, the best deal makers. That's Trump's label. He loves to call himself a deal maker. You could have the best people in the world on this, and you are still going to find that there are sticking points and that both sides are going to be unwilling to compromise to a certain extent because they have certain goals, right? Ukraine does not want to give up territory. and Russia wants to be able to say that it is, beaten back the Ukrainians and is reconstituting the old Soviet Union, right? There are really, really antithetical goals at play here between what's going on in the Kremlin and what's going on in Kyiv. And then the U.S. perspective on all of this is, well, we just want the war to stop. And what we've seen is a very sort of transactional approach to foreign policy, right? We're demanding the mineral deal from the Ukrainians. It's not entirely clear what all of this is going to accomplish, but the bottom line, I think, as you said very, very astutely, is that this is not a cakewalk, and that I personally think Trump misjudged just how deeply entrenched and how complicated this conflict is going to be untangled.
All right. Thank you, Micah, for joining me and sharing your views. On that
My
note,
pleasure.
I'm out of time. Thank you for watching NewsX World, and this is all on The World Report.